Hello and welcome to PHILOXENIA. This time we are unfortunately not sitting in Bruno Kreisky's villa in the Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, because due to COVID restrictions, we are not able to do a talk with the wonderful author Sophy Roberts, who is sitting next to me here. So we stayed on the British island, Brexit Island, which is in the Corona tempest at the moment. And Sophy, fortunately, had the good idea to invite me to come to her office here in West Dorset, which is on the coast of the English Channel, in which I swam yesterday, which was just lovely. And so I came to her wonderful, wonderful house, her wonderful office. The sun is setting outside. You should all be here and we should all drink rhubarber juice, but we can't. So we have to do our online talk today for 1 hour. We are live on Facebook now. You can always watch the link later also on the Kreisky website. And I want to welcome you very much, Sophy. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you very much indeed for all the effort that you and my publishers have put into this event, because it's heartening that there are still readers at times like this, and trying to reach out to them through Zoom is not the same as in person, especially for a traveler like me. But I'm very grateful to you and Bruno Kreisky for the event.
Which brings me to the fact that we are talking in English today and about the book, and the book originally, of course, is also in English, but the German version of the Lost Pianos of Siberia, Die verlorenen Klaviere Sibiriens, is just published at Schollnei in Austria and Germany and Switzerland. And it is a big, big honor for me that I grabbed the opportunity to present it, because when I read the first pages, I knew this was at least a book for me, but probably for many, many thousands of people, because I was gripped by the idea and by the eccentricity of the idea to go and look for pianos in Siberia that have been partly lost and will also partly stay lost. And this is what Sophy did, which is quite an idea to go as a, okay, so Sophy is a travel journalist, so it was not completely absurd for you to go to Siberia, but not many people go to Siberia and write a book that takes years to develop, years also to, obviously, to finance, years to, in many trips, multiple trips, take her away from her family and her usual work here in Britain. But she was apparently so driven to do that. And it all started with a Siberian tiger sitting in the sun and having a good time. But could you explain to us how you came to the idea to do this at all?
Of course, and thank you for that introduction. I think what I should do, just so that it's very clear the region I'm talking about, is maybe you could show the map of Siberia on the screen, because this gives a sense of the geography. I think it's just coming up. In the meantime, I'll keep speaking, but the extent of Siberia is huge. It's also a very unstable, geography, because it has had different boundaries through time. I went by Anton Chekhov's description because it was much the most poetic, which is that it begins in Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains and ends, and he used this wonderful phrase, goodness knows where. So that gave me the poetic latitude to go all the way over to Kamchatka, over on the Pacific edge, you can see there, and the Kuril Islands, which come down from Kamchatka above the top of Japan. It also allowed me to incorporate the far north, right up inside the Arctic Circle, which you can see on the screen now, and down into the steppe lands which border Mongolia. It's a huge area. It's about 1/10 of the world's land surface, 9 different time zones. And I found that sort of mesmerizing in its extent ever since I was a child, when I used to look at this big, I had a globe on my on my bedside table as a child. It was a light, and Siberia was just empty, empty.
Yeah.
And yet I knew so little about it. So I then proceeded to, the reason it started, interestingly, was, again, the power of a phrase. I am a writer, and the power of a phrase. And I heard this phrase, the Lost Pianos of Siberia, from a German friend who lives half his year in Mongolia. So what happened, it was in 2015, and I was staying with this friend that I'd made many years ago. I'm a journalist, I work often for the Financial Times. I'd done a piece 15 years ago on the cashmere industry in Mongolia. I'd made friends with this gentleman, and he lived about 8 hours from the capital, which I think you've been to, Ulaanbaatar. And he lived in this spectacular valley, which you can now see on the screen, the Orkhon Valley. He married a Mongolian, 3 children. And we were staying there in one of these, in these felted tents, these gers, as they're called, which have the most exquisite acoustics because of the felted edge. So you can imagine how sound rolls around in a very intimate way in this sort of felted circle with a whole...
Big enough for an intimate recital,
which is what I heard. There was a young Mongolian pianist who was playing on a bad, because of the climate, Yamaha Grand that had lost its sound. But I was profoundly moved by her playing. She was playing some Bach, and I leant over to my German friend and said, I've never heard anything so beautiful. You know, the stars are above, the smoke is rising from the fire in this beautiful tent. I'm with my children. It's music as you want it to be heard. It's not recorded like we hear music now. It's live in space and time. And I lean over to my German friend. I say, how beautiful it is. And he wags his finger. He goes, no, the sound is not right. You must find her one of the Lost Pianos of Siberia. And it was the phrase that launched a book.
Yeah. And we cannot give away, of course, the clue of the book, because otherwise people won't read it till the end, what happens to the Mongolian pianist and the Lost Pianos of Siberia. But to look, I mean, for me, one of the striking things when I started reading is that you actually don't play the piano yourself.
No, I don't. I'm not a musician. I'm not a historian. And I don't speak Russian, so I'm entering extremely dangerous territory. But I am profoundly curious. I'm a journalist, and I also have always loved, I've always loved the literature in translation of which has come out of Russia. So I felt that I could take the risk of failure, perhaps, but I wanted to at least make the attempt in trying to use my search for a piano for this young Mongolian pianist as a way to open doors in Siberia. Because what is important to understand is I'm British. It's not a great relationship with Putin's Russia. I'm a journalist. It's not a great place for a journalist to work. But if you knock on the door of a stranger in that part of the world and say, I'm looking for a piano, you've immediately created neutral territory. And that neutral territory is very powerful, because once you step, and we talked about this earlier, Tessa, once you step over the threshold, something magical happens in that part of the world. The connection and the respect that they showed to me, and I hope I did to them, became the space that I could work. And so through the pursuit of an object, I was able to make a connection with story, history, loves lost, passions found, whatever it might be. So there was one, I'll give one example. There was, in the revolution, there was a British consul to Western Siberia. He was a great musician, a passionate musician. He met Tolstoy just near here in Bournemouth in England, and he became obsessed by Tolstoy's Russia and then by the piano. And he described the piano in Russian culture as a passport. It's a unique passport in Russia. And that, in a way, was the ticket that let me go into people's lives with a degree of trust and mutual respect.
Well, which we all who have traveled in Russia always realized how wonderful, warm, and welcoming Russians are once you get over the threshold, which the politics sometimes try to hinder.
Mm-hmm.
But you were not to be deterred, which is wonderful. You just did.
Yeah.
But what you did, which is, I think, one of the big important things about the book is you weave together the instrument and its history with the history of the country and the political development. And it's just mind-boggling how much sort of the instrument of the piano can explain to you in non-political terms, but without, you feel everything throughout the last 200 years since this pianomania started. And this is what you start with also in the book, to explain how Franz Liszt took Russia by storm, like a Rolling Stones rock star.
Indeed.
Can you, I think we also have a picture of this, how Liszt plays in St. Petersburg.
Yes, so this is what my German friend, when he gave me that phrase, the Lost Pianos of Siberia, was referencing, was a knowledge he had, having read a wonderful Walker's biography of Liszt, how Liszt had walked into St. Petersburg and taken the city by storm. And this was building on a tradition that Catherine the Great had started, that her daughter-in-law Maria had then massively encouraged with state subsidies for German makers from the German-speaking lands. They couldn't make pianos quick enough in Russia. And this was all through the Tsarist period. It was extraordinary. And because of these tax breaks, they were really inexpensive. So there was one particular Russian critic of the 1840s, 1850s, who said if there were 100 apartments in St. Petersburg, 96 would have a piano, and there would also be a tuner. So this huge fashion for the instrument, this bourgeois instrument, a sign of status, a sign of European identity, Western European identity. Then, of course, as this pianomania was taking hold, European Russia, so everything on the western side of the Urals, they were beginning to move with even greater numbers with exiles, mavericks, governors, misfits, princesses following their libertarian husbands across the Urals, and they took out of a conviction that music gave them identity as a sophisticated European, but also that music gave them solace. They would, against all odds, take instruments with them. And this is at a time long before a railway. This is at a time long before the ease of travel. This is at a time when there was just the great, Siberian tract, which was this rough road. Here's a wonderful image where you wanted to travel the great Siberian tract in winter because at least it was frozen. In spring, of course, it turns to mud and sort of swarms of mosquitoes. So there are spectacular stories of instruments, as well as instruments that survive to this day, that traveled in the backs of these sledges.
I mean, I have to say that, of course, this is the even more intriguing story. It was not a violin that they took with them, but a piano, which was, to strap a piano on a donkey or on a train is really a difficult thing to do. And one of my favorite stories, also because I saw it myself when I took the Trans-Siberian Railway with my children once from Moscow to Beijing, we stopped in Irkutsk and got out and saw the house where Count Sergei Volkonsky and Maria Volkonskaya, his wife, were staying during his exile. And this is for me, one of these crucial stories, how there is a reformist movement in Russia in 1825. They try a revolution against, and it's not a revolution in the sort of, they are aristocrats who are trying to impose a little bit more of a civil regime on their Tsars, on the Romanovs, and it fails. And so Count Volkonsky gets exiled to Siberia, and his wife decides to come with him and takes the piano, leaves the son at home and takes the piano to Siberia. I mean, this is sort of, for me, one of these stories where you can feel how the idea of the piano moving into this vast land and what it did there, because she then.
Yeah, I mean, what's very interesting, and that I'm glad you've seen that piano in Irkutsk, because it's a very important one that survives to this day, and it still plays. And it played in the prison cell. She was a very persuasive woman, Maria Volkonskaya. And so she managed to persuade the governors to let her have this piano in jail. And there's a photograph in the book taken by another contemporary revolutionary that he painted of Maria playing. And can you imagine in a lightless prison, just to have the sound of music, what solace that must have given. And also a connection with this world that they'd left behind. But what is really interesting is that what her passion for music was shared by a number of these, what they're called the Decembrist revolutionaries. It's a story be very familiar to people who are Russophiles, but it is a wonderful story. But they then started, after their release from prison, they had to stay in Siberia forever. They started to spread education, musical education. They had a library built up of some 10,000 books. They started to teach others in these regions that had not seen the wealth of Moscow and Petersburg in piano music. And you also, at the same time, had these rather hungry merchants that were making a lot of money in the tea trade, a city called Kyakhta, which it's a sort of dust-blown sort of hellhole now. But then it was one of the wealthiest places on earth. And it had these extraordinary cathedrals, which have now, they look like they're in complete ruin. They're in complete ruin because it was the center of the revolution, did its bloody worst there. But we're talking at a time in the 19th century when they were bringing in piano tuners from Kiev on Warsaw, and they were bringing in teachers from Poland to teach these children to play piano. And this is a place that now you wouldn't believe it. It's fascinating history.
But one of the keys for you to your piano search is not only the lost pianos, but the last piano tuners of Siberia.
Yeah.
Where I'm always astonished. I turn another page and there pops up another one of these magnificent characters who these piano tuners are.
Well, I've always, like lots of writers and journalists, I've always liked an underdog. And I remember watching Denis Matsuev, the Russian concert pianist, playing at Carnegie Hall. And then in the middle of the interval, he was spectacular. But in the interval, I watched this tuner scurry onto the stage and silently do something and do his magic. And then the concert continues, but no one knows his name. Now, what I discovered is, how do you find these piano stories in Siberia? You find them through the generosity of piano tuners and lots of other mechanisms, but through piano tuners. And the gentleman you just saw on the screen there, he was the head of the Siberian Piano Tuners Association. He's in Novosibirsk. He was very generous and put me onto all sorts of leads. And of course, provenance in a country with a history like, a very disturbed history like Russia's, is not easily found. But I did encounter tuners that had done their best to hold on to the stories that this box of ivories and strings might hold. There was one, I don't think I've ever spoken about this story, he's not even in the book because there were so many of them, but he was a tuner in Kamchatka who'd been at his trade for 50, 60 years, and he had the serial number of every single piano he'd ever tuned, written in this beautiful handwritten notepads. And it was like opening up a piece of history that people don't normally stare into. And as you start to go into the serial numbers, you start to go into the families, you ring a few numbers, sort of magic happens. So it was, I loved the tuners. I mean, some of them were a bit, shifty, but the vast majority were people that love music, love an instrument, and want to preserve something. That's why they do it.
But shifty in the sense that they wanted to make money.
Oh, you know, they'll tell you anything.
That's the Romanov piano. And
yeah,
then of course it's not.
Yeah, we had a lot of that. I had a lot of, look, have you seen, this is another of the Decemberist pianos, and, you know, a lot of full sleeves. But failure is part of the journey, and a very important part of the journey that I'm honest about in the book. You know, it's full of diversions, it's full of wild goose chases, but the hunt was as relevant to me as the finding, if you will. I think it often is, because that was the obsession. You know, it's sort of like unrequited love, isn't it? It's the obsession of a love affair. Completely. Not necessarily just the completion.
I loved it that you also admitted when it was just not there. Yeah. You know, couldn't find it in the end. You know, all this thing. You know, in case of the Romanovs, for example, probably it was to be expected that it was not an easy search to go to Yekaterinburg, where they all got killed in 1918, and where everyone has been searching for, I don't know, Anastasia's ghost or whatever for past 100 years, then to expect to find the piano.
No, I mean, I'm an optimist. Yeah, I am a real optimist. So that was, I always hoped, but also I felt quite strongly that the piano, Edmund de Waal's book, which has been a very powerful influence in my life, The Hair with Amber Eyes, it's a wonderful book. And he talks, I may misquote him slightly, so forgive me if I do, but he writes in that book, you know, objects have always been lost and stolen, as retrieved and given as gifts. It's how you tell their stories that matters. And I found that from a writing point of view, very liberating, because it was, I needed to look for the stories and tell them as well as I could without becoming overly anxious about sometimes the truth not delivering the happy Hollywood ending, because truth doesn't quite work like that. So I did find that a sort of powerful, it was a lens. The piano becomes a lens to tell the history of Russia and Siberia in particular over the last 200 years, 250 years.
But quite difficult if you think, you know, the Russians themselves often have a view of history which for me sometimes lacks the three-dimensional view that we learn to have from our history in our respective countries. And by far it is really not easy, as we can see now here in Britain with the imperial history. And of course the Austrian history is really full of huge mistakes and wrong turns that were devastating for the whole world. And it took a long time in Austria, for example, to have some kind of grip on our own history, and it's by far not finished, this whole process. But in Russia today, you can speak about the Soviet Union, you can speak about the Decabrist rebellion, you can speak about the murder of the Romanovs, you can speak about the prison camp situation in the various, you know, under the Tsars and then under Stalin, and these political repressions, as they are called today in Russian, are sometimes not at all understood in all their layers, because modern Russia under Putin doesn't really teach us this to people in the classrooms. Students might not learn the history in all their facets. And so for you to go and explain through the piano all these different, you know, the last 200 years of Russian history was for me a relatively ambitious aim, which I thought you mastered quite well, because you just tried to do it according to facts, and you were relatively cool in this describing Valam Salamov's writing, as well as the description of the Romanovs killings up to today, basically what happens with all these attempts to have this cultural piano teachings ongoing in a country where it doesn't count as much as people would hope so.
Yeah, it was It was very difficult, and it made my heart beat fast on sleepless nights, especially when I was encountering stories of music or a lack of, a travesty of freedom, as one Gulag survivor described the sound of music in Kolyma, which was the worst of the worst. I struggled with the darkness. I struggled with differing points of view. I struggled with even the numbers, you know, these incredibly contentious numbers. Is it 2.8 million who perished in the Gulag, or by Applebaum's estimation, or is it the Russian estimation at X? I just tried to approach it with a fair and self-aware mind of somebody who was relying upon the stories told by the kind of everyday Siberians I met. And without judgment. I always try to travel without judgment and let their voices come out. So some of my friends and literary friends have said, I wish there was more of you in the book. I didn't want to write that kind of travel book. I wanted to show, not tell, a more intimate version of history through an object like a piano and people's relationship with that instrument than I did want to make any kind of really big sweeping. I didn't have the authority or the knowledge to command that kind of argument. I wanted to feel it from the ground. So being a traveler with my feet on the ground was really important to me, to feel it, you know. It's about, like, absolutely. I really believe travel, and it's the thing we're all hurting with now in COVID, is travel is an act of empathy. It's and when you remove that contact, when you remove the sharing of a meal and the breaking of bread or whatever it is, something is really lost to human connection and human freedom. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to fight for in that book, is connection matters, and it matters by us moving through a place and knocking on doors and without judgment, listening to another person's version of the same event.
Well, it's certainly also the case that if you bring the stories of people who live there now without pressing them on political, on anti-Putinist statements or something, you might actually also learn a lot about the society and about how they get on under these circumstances, like you did with this wonderful family of piano tuners, where she encounters not one piano tuner, but of course after one meal she already has 3 generations. What is it, Sergei?
Oh yeah, no, they were wonderful. They were a family in Novosibirsk, and they occupied the basement of the Novosibirsk Opera House. The gentleman on the right he was fantastic, and he had driven a truck through the coldest, most miserable bit of Siberia, and he just didn't want his children to live the same life. So when he sold his house, he spent a quarter of it on a piano, in the belief that music would give his children a different future from truck driving. And indeed it did. The gentleman in the red shirt, you see in the picture, he's the main tuner in the Novosibirsk Opera House. He's also plays the viola in the orchestra. And then the two grandsons, the chap with the bow tie is one of my real true heroes. And the grandson at the front will no doubt follow the same path. But yeah, I mean, the stories that family could tell were, 3 generations of Russian history, all because I knocked on the door of that basement saying, I hear you have an interesting piano.
And did he lead you to pianos that you were looking for?
Yes, they were. Well, yes, I ended up, this was a city that was a very important part of my search. Novosibirsk has the largest opera house in Russia. It has a very interesting relationship, a long relationship with music. And I met there, through the network of tuners, another gentleman he was amazing. He taught jazz at the Novosibirsk Conservatory. He'd survived the siege of Leningrad. And he'd survived the siege of Leningrad by his own story, listening to music. He was given a phonograph by his mother while she was working in hell, in the hospitals, and trying to, they were eating cat to survive. But he has memory only of music during this period because he'd play records. He would play records. And he also had a great friend of his mother's who was a part of the Leningrad Philharmonic, who used to have a blue-throated bird that would sing. So everything was about music during this terrible time, during the siege. And he led me to one of the most important piano stories I found. And what's important to understand is when I say the most important piano stories I found, I mean that from the point of view of an instrument that really moved me, both in its sound and also in its history. And this instrument, he was the last person to tune it before it got sort of bundled up and hidden in a back room of a university not far from Novosibirsk. And it belonged to this woman called Vera Lotar-Shevchenko, who was French-born. She, Le Figaro, in her early career, was calling her, really writing pieces about this prodigy. She fell in love with a Russian. They moved back in the 30s to Leningrad, and her husband was arrested and sent to the Gulag. Vera was a strong woman and she protested. So she was sent to another Gulag where she spent 7, 8 years, lots of slightly unstable stories here, but 7, 8 years. And when she came out of the Gulag, her husband had gone. She walked out into the street in her prisoner's peacoat, and she knocked on the door of the local music school and asked if she could play piano. And the music school said, of course. And they listened to this woman play, note perfect, this magnificent squall of Chopin, Beethoven, Bach, that had all been in her head through her labor camp experience. And it turned out she'd been practicing on a wooden bunk that had been carved into the side of her bed, that her friends had carved into the side of her bed. And so the power of the imagination in a period of utter darkness was enough to sustain her. She never left Russia. She never wanted to leave Russia. She died in Russia and is buried. I visited and cleared her grave in Akademgorodok. And it was incredibly moving because then with the help of Russian media, they were great. We traced and found her instrument, which I joined the instrument to her last tuner who survived the siege of Leningrad. And all that sort of tragedy and sadness, and ultimately transcending that horror through the power of music, I found somehow reassuring.
Yeah,
somehow reassuring.
But it has such incredible flip side in itself, this Russian history with the piano, because of course the Soviets, after the revolution in 1917-18, they really wanted to also help a lot of Soviet citizens to play the piano. I mean, it was incredibly important to them. So they built up this whole industry of Bolshevik, like of Soviet pianinos, that were of course not what the Tsarist had at home in her palace in St. Petersburg, but it was a possibility to build up education, musical education all over the country and also in Siberia. So we have on the one hand this incredibly sad story of Tsarist and Bolshevik repression, and how people survived with the hope of instruments and music in their heads through these horrible camps. But then we also have the story how important music education was it was somewhat easier than the political education because it was allowed. And I remember that a lot in Russia, that so many people were just so educated about classical music, which you never find anymore in Western Europe, that people would be very, very good piano players, even if they didn't do this on a professional level.
And from a writer's point of view, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, because the level of musical education in the far reaches of the country they completely corrected my my levels of assumption and also cultural arrogance. You know, in my country, the grand piano is the object of a concert hall. In Soviet Russia, it's a much more domestic, democratized instrument. You know, they went from the Becker factory under the Tsarist period, these very grand instruments, that was nationalized by the state, and it became the Red October piano factory, much cheaper, distributed all over the USSR. And these Red Octobers are everywhere. You know, most of them utterly broken, but they did educate an entire nation in the power of music. And it was something that Denis Matsuyev, the pianist, the concert pianist, said to me early on. He said, you know, the difference between this New York audience and what you will experience in Siberia is really big. The Siberian audience, he just said it was his favorite audience because they understand everything. And he talked about the suspicious silences. Richter, who did a tour of Siberia in '86 when everything was crumbling down with glasnost and perestroika, he played in broken halls of culture, in broken towns and on bad pianos. But again, he just had to put a little written note saying we'll be playing at 6 p.m. and it'd be sold out in a nanosecond. So this appreciation for piano music is still there. You know, Russia's, like lots of countries, Germany excluded, has lost its piano making industry. When I started this project in March 2016, when I really committed to it, the same month, the last of Russia's piano factories closed, which gave me an even greater urgency to tell the story, if you will. But it was kind of staggering because you still had the education in people's ears in a certain generation. You know, my kids' age, they're all playing Chinese Chinese-made synthesizers, but it's still in the heads and the memories and the knowledge of anybody that was born 10 years before the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, did it make you think that our Europe-centric vision of the world also was changing while you were in the vast lands of Siberia? Because I always had the feeling, you know, in the end, it's really, you don't necessarily want to stay there because, you know, you go also around in the cities and you always think, and who is this person now? Who is she, the descendant of the decabrist aristocrats who stayed in the end in Siberia? Is she a farmer's daughter, or is she an astrophysicist doctor going on to develop the newest sort of you know, world-breaking success in her field? Because all of these things happen in Siberia, or happened, you know, because I think sort of maybe the speed of this, the investment in certain branches of technology and industry is not as strong anymore under Putin than it was in the competitive Soviet years fighting with the West. So how is that for you? Has the vision of Siberia changed for you?
Oh, completely. I mean, there's two things that happened. One, I wasn't expecting to like the place. You know, its history is gruesome, and the history that I've been educated in with Dostoevsky and the rest of it is gruesome, violent history, which had somehow forgotten the power of landscape. Siberia's landscape is fenceless on a scale that I work a lot in Africa, I've never seen it on this scale. It's just fenceless. It's a sense of space and time that we don't really have on this earth anymore. And I found that very uplifting. And it was a place I wanted to be. It was a spirit of place that is rare. And, you know, the shaman history with Russia and Siberia in particular is really real, and you feel it there. It's got a kind of thrum. It's hard to describe, but anybody that goes, you have. It's got a kind of a thrum. But the other side is, at the beginning of this, I would describe to family and friends, I'm going to look for a piano inn, and I would use this phrase, the back of beyond. And I had one very important moment when I was in the Altai Mountains, right in the remote area where it borders China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, etc. And I was in a mountain village there with an Aeroflot navigator, a former Aeroflot navigator, who wasn't very rich. And he was building, he was great. He was building a concert hall for 20, 30 people at the back of his wooden house. He really believed, this is him, Leonid, he really believed in education. He had a library of about 10,000 books. He amassed them through charm and perseverance. But he'd heard a young boy playing practicing piano on a keyboard that was painted onto a kitchen table. So, you know, not an unfamiliar story if people don't have an instrument. And he thought that was such a great pity that he went off to Moscow, and since has distributed about 41 pianos to these mountain villages in the belief that education, musical education, should belong to all. But he said to me, Sophie, if you find a piano, can you bring one to me first, because of this concert hall I'm building? And I said, oh, Leonid, but you are so far from everything. That's a kind of crazy thing to ask me. And he said, no, the world is very remote. We are at the center. And it was it was like, okay, so he's just totally skewed my sense of ethnocentricity, my Western arrogance, my British ego has just been totally thumbed down. And I was very grateful to him because he skewed my perspective for the rest of the journeys that I made.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, we were thinking if Sophie should read out of her book and me even out of the German one, which, by the way, has a fantastic translation. And the translator, Brigitte Hilzensauer, did a very, very good job to maneuver between the original English into contemporary German, of course, but also all these names, all these nuances that you have in Russian. I mean, it just works very well. There's an uninterrupted, comfortable flow of words. And I was very happy to see this wonderful translation. And we decided not to read in the end from the book because it's so complicated on Zoom already to listen to a conversation. But we hope, of course, that everyone will go and read her book and also read the German issue, which is out this week. We will open now the floor to some questions. If you have any, you can raise your hand digitally, and Jutta of Kreisky Forum will sort of let you in, and then you can ask your question. You can also write it if you are timid and give it to us. But before we do that, I would like you, because we are already not reading from the book, but there is a wonderful video clip that Sophie found. Maybe you can explain what it is, and then we will listen to it.
Yes, this is from a YouTube clip of Vera, the lady I was describing earlier on in the talk, who had been in that gulag for 8 years. And this is a recording of her playing. You can hear it on YouTube at full length, and it's very powerful. It's referenced in the book, so it's imperfect sound, but I will hand it over to Bruno Kreisky to play. It's with the photograph of Vera. I think that will that go through? Yeah.
I mean, it's really, if you think how touching that this French woman coming to the Soviet Union out of love and political conviction and goes through all the horrors of everything that can possibly go wrong, and then stays there to play in these concert halls.
She was very, I mean, she ended up in Akademgorodok, which is the science city of Siberia, created in the, you know, the 60s, 70s. It was at its height. And she found companionship and friendship amongst a group of brilliant Soviet intellectuals. And she found her version of freedom and a place where she was appreciated. And she had this wonderful mulbach instrument that she was given by one of the professors. And it was, I don't know, I found the whole place and its story and her sort of sense of some kind of salvation, one of the most moving parts of the whole kind of 4-year mad eccentric endeavor of looking for instruments.
Very touching. Do we have any questions, Jutta?
Yes, there is one hand raised. Hannah Hesse, you can talk now.
Hannah, can you hear us? Hannah is muted, I think.
Hannah, I think you can talk now.
Yeah.
No, my name is Herbert Orling. I'm the publisher of the German translation, and I want to say thank you to both of you for this wonderful presentation, dear Tessa and dear Sophie. And I hope we will meet each other soon personally in Vienna or maybe in another place. And I hope the book will be successful. Thank you for the presentation now.
Thank you for being the most wonderful publisher. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. What your appreciation of imagery and the quality of the paper and everything is just something we all writers dream of. I can't believe I got so lucky. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy that the translation is so fine, as Tessa said before.
Yeah, it is. It's really good.
Yeah, I'm told. I'm so ashamed that I don't speak the language. I'm told it is a really, really beautiful piece of work. I've written to Brigitte to thank her. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, next time in Vienna, because also Sophie, of course, has not stopped working now and is now in her restless state of a mixture of adventurer and journalist and author and historian and so on and so forth, looking for a new, to realize her new project, which might be slightly hindered at the moment by the fact that we all cannot travel. So where is your next journey taking you?
I'm just starting on a new idea which explores the creative power of restlessness, and especially in times of upheaval, and so sort of leaning into the literature of the 1930s, where of course your restless authors are some of the best, with Zweig and Joseph Roth and all the rest of them. But I'm starting on a journey which has a curious geographical arc, so yeah, it's exciting. If I can move, I will safely.
Well, as long as we cannot travel, in any case, we have to use books, for example, not only Netflix, but also books, to go on journeys in our minds. One of the issues that I was looking for in your book for the longest time, and then you only touched upon it at the very end, was Birobidzhan. Because one of the things that I was fascinated with was how Siberia, which was rather underdeveloped in general in most places, was then used by the Soviets as a kind of experimentation station for certain things. So in Murmansk, you know, where they had the nuclear ships park, they built up a city which basically had most of the year was dark, and you know, they had to give little children happy pills from September on, because you wouldn't survive otherwise the winter. But Birobidzhan was sort of the Jewish experiment, where the Soviets decided, let's send all the Jews to Birobidzhan, and there will be a Jewish autonomous district, and that way the anti-Semites hoped they would get rid of all the Jews from Moscow. And on the other hand, it was also for some people the hope that they could survive and culturally develop. And the whole thing, of course, was very, very difficult. And I was thinking at the beginning of the book that probably there would be some fine pianos there, as a lot of good musicians emigrated there, but you didn't find any.
No, I did too. So I spent about a week in Birobidzhan, and it is an area down on the Chinese border. It's a really godforsaken bit of territory where the mosquitoes seem bigger and nastier than any other part of Siberia. And I was fascinated by it. I'd read Masha Gessen's book about Birobidzhan, where the Jews aren't, and I thought, well, they've got to be, where there's a Jew there's a musician, so there's got to be some history here. And I ended up in this extraordinary Philharmonic hall, this kind of Soviet era Philharmonic hall, which looks like a sort of nightmare out of an Escher drawing. Sort of crazy staircases and concrete kind of structure that doesn't quite hold together. It was sort of beautiful and otherwise utterly peculiar. Yeah. And I went to the Philharmonic Hall desperately hunting for a piano or something that could lead me to some musicians in the city and in the region. And all there was a group of Israeli performers. There's just no real true history there. There's not enough Jews to make up a quorum. So it's a very peculiar place. And yeah, I really thought I would find a great piano there as well. I did a lot of that. I went to a lot of places where there was a dead end, and then places where you least expect to find a remarkable story, you do. So, up in Yamal, up in the Russian far north, where the reindeer herder communities still are. And I found a Nenets, one of these reindeer communities, reindeer herding communities, and they had a brilliantly trained musician among them who had benefited from the Soviet system of education. So it was all just full of surprises.
Yeah,
and so many didn't make it into the book because the book is long enough as it is.
Well, I mean, of course, we have probably endless stories to tell. What I thought about Birobidzhan when I came there, actually through an initiative of the Austrian Cultural Forum in Moscow, contemporary art projects where Russian and Austrian artists were working together, developing art projects there. And it was, I have to say, true that there is no, the Jewish community of the earlier decades is gone. But there is some kind of weird real life there, which is not necessarily Jewish, but I mean, who cares in the end? And out of this absurd plan to have these street barriers that have Jewish symbols in them, and all this is still sort of there, but you do have, like you say, this bombastic cultural palace, which was a typical thing to build and late. I mean, this looks as, I forgot when it was built, but we were there for some openings, and it's a pretty functional, impressive, not very beautiful structure, but it's there, and there is some kind of modern life wrapping around this idea, which is very Russian on the one hand and not Jewish. Russian,
there is a modern life there. I found it quite Chinese, actually. The town was a lot of neon, and it was quite Chinese. I mean, it was just interesting to me because I again approached it with expectation, and then that was blown apart. But that was my entire experience of Siberia. I approached it with expectation, and then I was through the act of looking, the act of talking, and the generosity of the Siberian people. My head was turned, and I had to listen and write in a different way, which is, that's why I love travel. It takes your assumptions and it turns them upside down and shakes them out. And I wrote a book, other people write a diary, other people's children, their lives change forever. Travel is a very powerful thing.
Well, it's a very good thing if you can write a book and then you take readers with you on this journey to have a little bit, you know, to shake up our all assumptions, how lives are. Do we have another question or any other
questions? Michael Freund, you're the next one.
We have to unmute Michael, I think.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's my photo. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Great.
we like it.
I'm the one who wrote to you this morning about.
Oh, hello, yes.
Hey. So first of all, I just want to second what Herbert Orlinger said. The translation is fantastic. It really reads like a book as if it was written in German. So that's very good. And the other thing, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just being grateful to Brigitte for that. So thank you.
And the other thing I meant to tell you is that, yeah, I'm really amazed at what you did, not knowing Russian and having the translator with you, and yet getting so much into all the psyches and all the details of their lives and the way they express themselves and so on. I think you did a fantastic job. I think that was very good. And the other thing, which I already asked you in the email, but maybe it's of interest also to other people, is you announced, and that was finished in February, so before COVID, but you announced that there will be concerts in the summer. Well, obviously not this summer, but there may be that your other protagonist, so to speak, the woman, the pianist, Odgorel, that she may give concerts, recitals next summer.
Absolutely. I mean, our lives are bound, our friendship runs deep, and her patron, this German gentleman, Christopher Gierke, is always, you know, she's done recitals before in France, and the intention was always for this book to also give a platform to her music. And unfortunately, that has been truly blown apart by COVID. I mean, the wonderful thing about Odgorel is she likes to play in intimate spaces, and the Mongolian tent is
the yurt.
Earlier, so it's a kind of perfect acoustic. And so, had this not happened, we would have been looking for those spaces together in Europe with just gentle, unpretentious performances. Would have been a spectacular thing to do, and we intend to do that when life changes for the better again. It's how I like music, you know. I find it, as I said, I'm not a historian, I don't speak Russian, I'm not a musician, so I like the intimacy of feeling part of.
The other thing, if I may add, that's the other thing that amazed me truly, that you managed to do all this without being any of the above. That is really amazing.
Well, a few errors here and there, but we try our best.
Very sensitive. Thank you very much. Michael, we should maybe see how, when COVID is under control, we all go together to this yurt concert in Mongolia and hear her play. That would be a good story.
Especially, Michael, if you're a cyclist, by judging from your photo. It's got very good mountain biking too.
Yeah, I would.
Thank you very much, Michael. Do we have any other question? Jutta?
Yes, Gertrud is next. Yes, Gertrud is next.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Gertrud.
Hello. Thank you so much, Tessa and Sophie, for this wonderful presentation. I just wanted to join Herbert Orlinger, the Austrian publisher, by thanking you. And I was wondering if, in a certain way, I find in your stories a lot of resilience, a lot of creativity. Mainly, I mean, very often the people that you are describing are women. And I was wondering if there is something which connects the dots of resilience and creativity, which we're also in a certain way we are witnessing with the women in Belarus and the Svetlana Alexeyevich, who is describing this kind of soft power that apparently music and creativity and arts are in a different way looking into politics and trying to find different answers. What do you say?
I think that that is a very sensitive point, and it is certainly something that at one stage in the writing of the book, I thought seriously about leaning into the female story in a very much more an overt way. You know, it begins with a woman. Odgorel is an inspiration, and the major inflection points are some of these female characters that we've talked about in the last hour or so. It's also, of course, the piano was the domestic instrument for women, so it was a way for them to express things in their time, and both emotional, privately, to do with unrequited love or whatever, but also their engagement with Russian culture. And there was wonderful, the Tsarina, the Romanov relationship with the piano up to their execution was one that sort of really moved me as well. I think that the idea of sort of soft power and resilience was, I had a female interpreter as well, which really helped. I think it's a very good one because it is a theme that I could have pulled out more strongly. Now you raise it. I should have maybe pulled it out more strongly because it's a very, very fair and interesting line of inquiry. I agree with you. And I kind of like that, you know, it's how do we approach these very tricky periods of our history without, in a way that listens as much as it speaks, and that's why I love my gender, but it's also why I like the stories that came out when I was on the road. I mean, you know, obviously that's a huge generalization as well, but yeah, I like what you've said, Gertrude, because I think it is a theme that I would have liked to have lent into more. I think it's really relevant, but sometimes you only realize these things when you hit the end of a journey. You know?
Well, also maybe we will have enough time to explore resilience and how women deal with it in repressive system, because it's not over. And no. At the moment, not in Belarus and not in Russia, and in many other places neither. So
there's a book, actually, I don't know, I'm sure it is because it was a huge seller here, but Christine Sutherland wrote a book called The Princess of Siberia, which is about Maria Volkonskaya's story. And that really is sort of an epic of the female soft power and resilience. It's beautifully, beautifully told. And I think it's really, I'm really glad you brought that thought to the room, because it's one that, yeah, it's very present right now as we try and work things out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gertrude. And I would say this was a good point to wrap up our talk.
There's one last question, if there is any time.
Okay. No, let's take it.
Okay, great.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
we can hear you.
This is Alex Radziner speaking. Just thank you for a great presentation. I may be the only questioner here who hasn't read your book yet, so I'm really looking forward to that pleasure and that joy. And I wanted to ask you whether writing this book and exploring the history of a whole country or area through the particular lens of an artifact at any time has given you an idea of saying, wow, maybe I could do this with another country and another artifact and come up with something very interesting? Or is that something that has yet
Well, my children are very naughty and tell me to go and look for the lost violins of Greenland, you know. But
trying to get you out of the house.
Yeah, I think I liked the mechanism, and as I say, Edmund de Waal's family story told through an object was a huge inspiration. But equally, this one held because the history and the history of it was so unique and kind of untold, really. It was a sort of ungoogleable story. I don't know how often I would be given that opportunity again, because you can't, you know, I can't kind of make it up. But I liked it as a way of controlling and invigorating the travelogue. You know, I was very lucky with the publishers I had, because they all understood and supported this particular thing of using a piano to tell the story of Siberia as a way of breaking down the genre that you associate with the travel. You know, travel tends to be, I start in A and I finish in Z. And when I started this, I wrote the book like that. And then I sent it to my publishers and they went, well, nice first draft. Now let's completely change it. Start when the piano enters Russian culture and finishes with the closing of the last piano factory. And that totally changed the structure of the whole book. And it released me from the genre of the travel writer and made me think more as a general nonfiction writer. So I liked the lens because it was a release from my own cliches in my profession that I came to this as a travel writer.
So the violence in Greenland, we will have to sort of think about this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
For listening. Thank you to everyone who dialed in today. And thank you most of all to Sophy Roberts to have written this wonderful book. Thank you very much, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you very much.